Welcome to the third lecture in my section Land and Landscapes. The second lecture focused on state policies and what the state did to reshape landscapes by forcibly removing people, especially in line with its ideology of spatial separation, known as apartheid. And that led to landscapes of dispossession, but of course landscapes of dispossession are all around us because there are other forces that are transforming landscapes around the world. And the force that I'm interested in looking at today is the force of capitalism. So it might be the post-apartheid period, but of course one still has the transformation of landscapes and new forms of dispossession. The title of this lecture is Dispossession in Post-Apartheid South Africa. Post meaning after. So you've got the apartheid period, 1948 to say 1990, then there was the transition, and then post-apartheid we date from the first democratic election in 1994. Alright, so post meaning after apartheid. And the force that I'm interested in today looking at is the forces of capitalist transformation. These are market forces. A capitalist system is all about creating value from the land, and market forces are at play in our landscapes, and of course landscapes around the world. So I could have chosen a whole lot of different ways to approach this topic. First point to make, I suppose, is that there are new forms of agriculture which require a great deal less labor, and so labor has been shed from farms. This is actually a worldwide phenomenon. With the capitalization of agriculture, it becoming more specialized machinery that's needed rather than manual labor. So that is one aspect, or one force, I suppose, that is reshaping farming landscapes around the world. So we could have a whole lecture on that. What my particular research interest is on tourism-oriented development, or tourism-oriented market projects. And that's what I'm going to be focusing on as an example of capitalist transformation of landscapes. So hence my focus this week on the production of new wilderness landscapes. Now you might think, what has the wilderness got to do with capitalism? Well, as you know, tourism is being promoted as one of the main forces of economic growth and job creation in South Africa. So tourists require wildlife and animals to look at. A lot of South African tourists that come to South Africa from overseas, that is what they want to actually see. So landowners are saying, well, you know, it's very difficult doing farming these days, very, very expensive. There's no subsidy from the state to farm any longer. It's just very difficult to make a living as, say, for example, a cattle farmer. Why don't we turn to tourism and make money from tourism? So instead of having cattle on the farm, the landowner decides to introduce game, or you can call it wildlife. If we do that, we can then call it a nature reserve, or we can call it a wilderness landscape. And remember from last week that landscapes are about power, and that power includes the power of naming the landscape. So if you now designate this piece of land as no longer being a farm, but being a piece of wilderness, that has actually very powerful effects. Just think about it. What does that do to the presence of people within the landscape? If I call a piece of land a wilderness, so for example, this was a former cattle farm, right? Now it's a wilderness. It's a nature reserve. If you look very carefully, you can just spot two eland or eland, which are a particular kind of game animal at the edge of the grassland, standing under a tree. So it's been converted from being cattle farm to wildlife or wilderness. For private landowners, there's a lot of money to be made in wildlife. How are they going to make money from this? Well, a number of different ways, and there's a number of different types of endeavors. You have high-end private game reserves. These focus on offering ecotourism, game viewing. Often they have luxury lodges. If you're a tourist there, you get taken on a game drive. You're paying a lot to be there. You're staying sometimes in quite upmarket and fancy accommodation. So the ecotourism, making money out of ecotourism is one way to go. This can include birding. The article you're reading for the tutorial by myself and my research student, Leif Chelstrup, you'll be able to see that birding is one of the activities that was offered on this land that we looked at, that got converted from a cattle farm into wilderness. So it could be a private game reserve, or it could be even more directly about making money. It could be a hunting farm, also known as a game farm, a private game farm. This includes trophy hunting, where certain animals fetch high prices at game auctions. What has happened is that wildlife has gained a value, particularly the wildlife that visiting trophy hunters or local trophy hunters want to hunt. And I'm going to give you some illustrations here. So first of all, this is the kind of ecotourism farm, where it's really a wilderness landscape, and you go there and you consume it as a tourist by going for walks or for game drives or doing bird watching. And here is your luxury lifestyle in your safari lodge. Even if you do sleep in a tented accommodation, it's very fancy tented accommodation. This too is a way of changing the landscape to make money out of wildlife. This is if you are offering your farm to be divided into sections where people can actually buy in and go and live and consume a lifestyle by living in a game farm. So this is actually in the Cape, and as you see, they're plotted to koop. You can buy a plot in a private game and nature reserve. So this is what I was saying about the wildlife acquiring value. This is the Soutpansberg, which is in the north of the country. And this is a game auction a game sale. This is where various trophy animals are sold at auction. They get sold at the auction, and they are sold for very high prices. Okay, they get sold at auction, and then they get put onto game farms. The hunters then come and shoot them after paying for that particular animal. Often you'll see they have spectacular horns, and it's the horns that are then mounted afterwards and put up on the wall as a trophy. So I'm sure you can recognize the buffalo for sale. But also for sale are some really interesting and different antelope. Some of you might not be familiar with the sable antelope. In Afrikaans it's called the swart witpens because it's black with a white tummy. In the list you'll see male, female, that there's in this particular game auction. There's white rhino for sale, 7 males and 6 females. Buffaloes, 24 males. The males generally have the biggest horns, right? The swart witpens, the sable antelope. You've also got Livingston, eland, and so on and so on. Gemsbok, Sesebes, Nyala, and so on. Different kinds of antelope. What's quite interesting is that this is not only for white people, it has been embraced by some members of the black elite who own game farms. The president of the country is one example, Cyril Ramaphosa. And it's quite interesting that a few years ago, 2012, I believe, he was really taken to task because it got leaked to the media that he had his private game manager bidding at an auction for a buffalo. And this was happening, of course, amidst a sea of poverty in South Africa, so many poor people. And he was out there buying an 18 million rand buffalo. 18 million rands, one animal. So that's how lucrative it is to do trophy hunting on your land, to allow trophy hunting on your land. So you buy the buffalo at the game auction, and then you charge the American or German hunter that amount, or more than that amount. Obviously you want to make money, to shoot that particular animal. So you can't have a wilderness landscape without wildlife, especially in South Africa. Once you have a wilderness landscape, it's got to have wildlife on it. And most of these places, once they've converted to attracting tourists or hunters, especially for tourists, they are very keen to show that they have with them, on their land, what is known as the Big Five. So regardless of the actual ecology or the environment, these private game reserves and game farms strive to get the Big Five. I want you to guess what the Big Five animals are before you turn to the next screen. Have a little think about it. Yes, of course, the lion, the rhino, the buffalo, the elephant, and the leopard. Having those animals on the land, of course, changes the whole nature of the place, with major implications for the labor tenants. We spoke about labor tenants in the last lecture. Often they're not needed to work anymore, but they live on the farm because that is their home. The farm is owned by a white landowner. It's privately owned land. So as researchers, we speak about these people as farm dwellers. It's more correct to say that than farm worker, because as I say, often they're not even working on the farm anymore, but they have generations of history there, and they live there. That is their home. So the farm dwellers. So we're talking now post-apartheid. So there's no more state policies that are trying to remove people because they're black. But nonetheless, there's still major dispossessions from land, and it's really due to the forces of the market. So in the past, these farm dwellers used to work with cattle. Now that they're wilderness landscapes for tourists, there are no cattle anymore on the farms, and therefore no work. Not only that, but because of the big five and, other wildlife, but especially, I suppose, the big five, dangerous game. There's some danger. It's not easy to be living in a game reserve. Okay, often there's a claim by the landowners that it's job creation. So there might be some work that's being provided as field assistance or hunting guides, preparing the meat on hunting farms and so on. But farmers and landowners are increasingly reluctant to have these families living on their land. I think this slide is very, very interesting. I don't know if you can make much out of it. I'll explain it for you. This is a hunter. He is posing with his trophy. The trophy is a wildebeest that has been killed. And he's standing behind the wildebeest, just with his hand on the top of the wildebeest. The photographer should not be taking the photo from the angle where you can see, but should be standing more to the left of the picture, taking the photograph front on. If you did it that way, you would actually not be able to see the black farm worker at all. He is invisible behind the dead animal and propping it up, so that the hunter doesn't have to hold up the animal, the dead animal, but can just rest his hand on it and, strike the pose of being the great white hunter or whatever. And the farm dweller's job is to support the photograph being taken, and then probably afterwards to prepare the trophy. Remember, the hunter doesn't want the whole animal. He only wants the head with the horns as the trophy. So I like this photograph. It's taken in the Eastern Cape on a hunting farm, because it is very symbolic about the place of the farm dweller in this landscape. Very symbolic. Please look at this photograph and think about it carefully. So this is often what you find then in the landscape. You find that when these spaces are turned into wilderness spaces, they're closed off. As this is a reason why they get closed off. It's a way of exerting power over the landscape and keeping people out. It's partly. Beware, dangerous game, electric fence, 24-hour surveillance, armed internal anti-poaching unit. Stop, dangerous animals, no cyclists, elephant knocking over a cyclist. Beware lion, and in various languages. Pas op leeu, and then I can't pronounce the isiXhosa. So it's all about warning, stay away. So this is now a leisure landscape, and I would argue that the word wilderness, using the word wilderness, has exerted power and reshaped it and made people see this previous farm in a completely new way. In addition, it's now a conservation landscape. Conservation is a very powerful word. It's very hard to argue against. You're using your land for conservation. That must be a good thing. Conservation can link with tourism, and can make money. But for whom? But yes, the fact that it's a conservation landscape makes it quite hard to argue against it. And the landowner has the power to make that decision if he wants to. What's also very powerful is this word wilderness, because our image of a wilderness landscape is one that has no people in it. If you close your eyes for a moment and think of a wilderness, do you see any people there? So these are actually farms with labor tenants who have lived on them for generations. So, I mean, I did a lot of research on this and have had a big research project with students doing interviews and writing up their master's and PhD thesis afterwards. And we found that the labor tenants, or the former labor tenants, the farm dwellers, have very few rights, even though there are some laws that were passed in the after 1994, in the post-apartheid period, which were intended to protect them. These laws really are not effective. And often the outcome, sadly, is again a landscape of dispossession. So you're going to be reading another article for my second tutorial. I think it's tutorial 8 in the course, but my second one, which documents the losses that farm dwellers suffer in these processes. What I want you to see is that the losses of losing this relationship with this landscape are not only material losses. Something material means something you can touch, something physical. So the land, loss of cattle, loss of their physical dwellings. But what's also important to see is that the losses through the dispossession are spiritual. The loss of the link to the ancestors through, graves now being part of, the graves are now in the game reserve or the wilderness space. The loss of personal histories, the loss of community histories, the loss of identities. So this is an important lecture because what I'm trying to show you here is that dispossession didn't just end with the end of apartheid. There are many forces creating dispossession still in the countryside, and landscapes continue to be fought over. There's resistance and change, resistance and power, and I think that this example that I've given you from my own research is an excellent example to show you that. Once again, the slide of the now converted land used to be a farm. Now it's a wilderness with wildlife in it. And the big question is, what happened to the people in this landscape? So this lecture is linked to the tutorial reading, the article written by myself and Leif Chelstrup based on our research on the conversion of farms in KwaZulu-Natal. It's one of my favorite articles and one that I think I'm most proud of, because these are hidden histories in the landscape and suffering that people don't know about. So I think it's important that academics write about these kinds of things. And this is not about the state doing anything. This is about landowners making decisions based on how they can make money out of their land. So it's about, I would see it as part of capitalist transformations of landscapes and the power of tourism. Okay, so that's the end of this lecture. Thank you.